The bell above the door didn't just ring. It cut through the humid, grease-heavy air like a warning shot. Outside, the storm had turned the parking lot into a black lake, rain lashing against the plate glass with a rhythm that matched the headache pulsing behind my eyes. Then the door swung open, dragging the scent of ozone and wet pavement into the diner, overpowering the stale smell of hash browns for exactly 3 seconds. Everything stopped. The hiss of the grill, the clatter of silverware, even the low murmur of the 2 truckers at the counter seemed to suspend in the sudden drop of pressure. She walked in. She didn't check the menu or scan for a seat. She looked straight at me, her gaze dark and unflinching. Tuesday nights in a town like this are supposed to be dead. A slow bleed of time until the sign flips. The diner was a box of fluorescent light humming against the dark windows, a beacon for anyone trying to outrun the quiet. I knew the architecture of this place better than I knew my own apartment. I knew the exact pitch of the refrigerator's whine, the way the linoleum was worn smooth in front of the pass, and the specific, sticky resistance of table 6. But mostly, I knew the exhaustion. It wasn't just tired, it was a physical weight, a dull ache settling in the arches of my feet and the small of my back after 10 hours on the floor. The smell of the place, burnt coffee, fryer oil, and lemon cleaner, clung to my skin like a second layer, something I could never quite scrub off in the shower. I moved through the motions on autopilot, wiping down the counter, refilling sugar dispensers, my hands performing the rituals of service while my mind drifted somewhere else. Then there was booth 4, Adrienne. She sat there like she did every Tuesday, a study in stillness amidst the low-grade chaos of a diner shift. She was a disruption in the pattern. In a room full of worn denim and work boots, she wore a charcoal coat that looked soft to the touch, tailored and expensive, shedding rain like diamonds onto the cracked vinyl seat. She never took it off, just unbuttoned it enough to reveal the collar of a crisp shirt underneath. She didn't fit here. She looked like she belonged in a city gallery or a high-rise office, somewhere with glass walls and silence. Yet here she was, ordering black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and opening a leather-bound sketchbook on the table. The routine was always the same. I'd bring the pot over, the steam rising between us, and she'd nod, a quick, sharp dip of her chin. She rarely spoke more than 2 words at a time. Thank you. Black. But she watched. That was the thing that made the air thicken around her booth. She wasn't drawing the salt shakers or the pie case. Most of the time, the pen didn't even touch the paper. She just held it, poised, while her eyes tracked me across the floor. It wasn't the leering stare I got from the guys at the counter, the ones who thought a $2 tip bought them the right to comment on my smile. This was different. It was precise, surgical. I could feel her gaze weighing the tray in my hand, measuring the fatigue in my shoulders, cataloging the way I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. It felt like she was reading the subtext of my posture, seeing the exhaustion I tried so hard to hide behind the customer service mask. I'd catch her reflection in the dark window as I walked past, her head turning slightly to follow my movement. It made the hair on my arms stand up, a prickle of static that had nothing to do with the storm outside. I found myself straightening my spine, checking the apron strings, performing for an audience of 1. Why did she come here? To watch a waitress run herself ragged for minimum wage? To study the aesthetics of burnout? There was a mystery to her solitude, a deliberate quality to the way she occupied the space. She wasn't hiding, she was waiting. And every time I poured her coffee, I felt the proximity of her attention like a physical heat, a charged silence that drowned out the hum of the lights and the rain hammering against the roof. The dinner rush was starting to swell at the door, the noise level rising, threatening to break the strange, quiet connection tethering me to booth 4. The shift didn't just pick up, it detonated. The door swung open and stayed open, admitting a damp parade of families seeking refuge from the downpour, truckers with deadlines etched into their faces, and teenagers, loud with the invincibility of a Tuesday night. The quiet intimacy of the early evening shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of noise. The air, previously heavy with rain and grease, grew hot and close, thick with the smell of wet wool, frying onions, and the sharp, metallic tang of ketchup. I slipped the mask on tight. You know the one. The customer service veneer. A barrier of efficiency and forced brightness that protects the soft parts of you from the world. My smile became a reflex, a muscle twitch disconnected from any actual emotion. Coffee? You got it. More napkins? Coming right up. The special is the meatloaf. I became a machine of motion, my body moving through the narrow aisles with a muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. I balanced trays laden with plates that radiated heat against my forearm, the ceramic heavy and unforgiving. The kitchen was a war zone. I could hear the cook, Marco, shouting orders over the roar of the exhaust fan, the crash of plates stacking in the dish pit, the sizzle of burgers hitting the flat top. It was a cacophony of demands, a relentless assault on the senses that usually left me feeling hollowed out and brittle. But tonight, the chaos felt different because of the stillness at booth 4. Amidst the blur of motion, the spilled sodas, the crying toddlers, the impatient tapping of credit cards on the counter, Adrienne remained a fixed point of calm. She was the anchor in the storm. She hadn't touched her coffee. The black liquid sat perfectly still in the white mug, a dark mirror reflecting the fluorescent lights above. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't reading the local paper filled with high school sports scores. She was just watching. I rushed past her table, a pitcher of ice water in one hand and a stack of menus in the other, my hair escaping the clip at the nape of my neck, sweat prickling along my spine. The diner was a blur of color and noise, a frantic watercolor painting running in the rain. But as I pivoted on my heel to head back to the kitchen, I caught her eye. It wasn't a casual glance. She held my gaze for a split second, cutting through the noise, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a summons. It wasn't a demand for a refill. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the madness without pity. In that tiny gesture, she created a secret channel between us, a quiet frequency that ran beneath the clamor of the dinner rush. I see you, the nod seemed to say. I see the performance, and I see the exhaustion underneath. The heat from the pass hit me in the face as I grabbed 2 plates of eggs, the smell of butter overwhelming. I spun back out onto the floor, dodging a kid running toward the bathroom. But my mind stayed tethered to that booth. Why was a woman like her spending hours in a place like this? She wore the kind of quiet confidence that usually comes with money or power, or both. Her coat, draped over the back of the booth, probably cost more than I made in 3 months. She could be at the wine bar across town, the one with low lighting and jazz, or at home in some high-ceilinged living room with a real fire. Instead, she was here, bathed in harsh light, surrounded by the smell of cheap coffee and damp coats. There was a mystery to her solitude that felt deliberate. She wasn't waiting for a friend. She never checked the door. She wasn't working. The sketchbook remained open to the same blank page. She was simply existing in the space, absorbing the atmosphere like she was studying a foreign culture. And I was the primary subject. Every time I circled back to her section, checking on the couple at table 5 or wiping down table 3, I felt the weight of her presence. It was grounding. When the noise got too loud, when the demands felt like they were scraping my nerves raw, I would glance toward booth 4. She was always there, unmoving, unflinching, a splash of dark, calm water in a churning sea. She made the chaos bearable, just by witnessing it. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the rush peaked and finally broke. The families paid their checks and bundled back out into the rain. The truckers rumbled away into the dark. The noise receded like a tide going out, leaving the diner scarred and quiet in its wake. The sudden silence was almost louder than the noise, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. We were alone again. The exit of the last family felt like a vacuum seal breaking. The door clicked shut, latching against the wind, and the diner exhaled. The air, previously agitated by the friction of movement and the cacophony of voices, settled into a heavy, resonant stillness. It was just me, Marco scrubbing down the grill in the back with a rhythmic shh, shh of steel on steel, and a couple of stragglers in the far corner nursing cold fries. And her. Always her. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder, a high-frequency drone that drilled into the sudden quiet. The rain against the plate glass windows shifted from background noise to the main soundtrack, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that made the world outside feel vast and hostile, and the world inside this glass box feel incredibly small, intimate. I stood behind the counter, leaning my hip against the stainless steel, watching the steam rise from the dishwasher in lazy, curling ribbons. My feet throbbed, a dull, rhythmic reminder of the last 2 hours, but the adrenaline crash hadn't hit yet. Instead, there was a strange, vibrating tension under my skin, a restless energy that had nowhere to go. I looked at the coffee pot on the warmer, half full, burnt. I should brew a fresh one. Or I could just walk over there. In the rush, refilling a cup is a transaction. It's a calculation of seconds. Pour, smile, move. But now, picking up that pot felt like a decision. It wasn't a chore anymore. It was an excuse. A valid, professional reason to breach the distance between the safety of my counter and the magnetic pull of booth 4. I checked the room. The stragglers were arguing in hushed tones over a crumpled map, oblivious to everything else. Marco was singing softly to himself in Spanish, lost in the steam. No one was watching. I picked up the pot. The glass handle was warm against my palm, a grounding sensation. I walked out from behind the counter, my sneakers squeaking faintly on the linoleum. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet, marking my approach like a drumbeat. I moved towards her, conscious of every step, conscious of the way the apron tied at my waist, conscious of the stray hair I knew was sticking to my neck. As I approached her booth, the smell of the diner, that pervasive, oily, heavy scent of fried potatoes and sanitizer, seemed to thin out. It was replaced by something sharper, cleaner. Sandalwood, damp wool, the smell of rain on pavement before the mud kicks up. It was distinct, expensive, and completely out of place here. It cut through the grease like a knife, clearing my head. I stopped at the edge of her table. She didn't look up immediately. She was looking at her hands, resting flat on either side of the sketchbook. Her fingers were long, bare of rings, the nails short and clean. Top off? I asked. My voice sounded rusty, too loud in the hush, cracking slightly on the second word. She turned her head slowly, lifting her gaze from her hands to my face. Up close, her eyes weren't just dark. They were a deep, shifting slate, intelligent and tired. "Please," she said. I poured. My hand, usually rock steady after years of hauling trays, gave a traitorous little tremor. The dark liquid splashed slightly against the side of the white mug, a tiny imperfection in the ritual. I held my breath, waiting for a reprimand, a sigh of annoyance. She didn't look at the coffee. She looked at my hand, watching the tremor, then up to my eyes again. "The storm," she said. Her voice was low, textured like rough silk. It wasn't small talk. It felt weighty, like she was handing me a stone she'd been carrying. "It wipes the slate clean, doesn't it?" I paused, the pot hovering midair, steam curling around my wrist. It was the first time she'd said anything to me other than a thank you or an order in 3 weeks of Tuesdays. The question hung there, stripping away the server-customer script I relied on. "It tries," I said, the words slipping out before I could polish them. But the mud always comes back. A corner of her mouth ticked up, a micro-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but softened them all the same. "Architecture of exhaustion," she murmured, almost to herself, her eyes dropping to the sketchbook for a second before returning to me with renewed intensity. "You wear it well, but you shouldn't have to wear it at all." The air between us suddenly felt very thin, very hot. The exhaustion in my legs evaporated, replaced by a nervous, electric hum that started in my chest and radiated out to my fingertips. She wasn't just watching the waitress. She was seeing the person trapped inside the uniform. She saw the fatigue not as a job requirement, but as a burden I was carrying. I need the hours," I stammered, retreating to the safety of practicality, to the simple facts of rent and bills. "I know," she said softly. "We all need something." I pulled the pot back, clutching it like a shield against my chest. "Let me know if you need anything else." "I will," she said. And the way she said it, steady, promising, made my stomach flip. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a deferral. I walked back to the counter, feeling her gaze on my back like a physical touch, heavy and warm. I set the pot down with a clatter that made me wince. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, loud enough that I was sure she could hear it from across the room. Just then, the office door in the back clicked open. The manager, Dave, stuck his head out, his face illuminated by the blue light of a computer screen. "I'm doing payroll in the back. Don't bug me unless the place is burning down. Got it?" "Got it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He slammed the door. The lock clicked, a sound of finality. The floor was mine. The stragglers were standing up, zipping coats, leaving a pile of crumpled bills on the table. The bell jingled as they left, and then silence rushed back in, absolute and heavy. The diner was empty, except for me and her. We were effectively alone. The realization washed over me, terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. The professional supervision was gone. The buffer of the rush was gone. It was just the rain, the hum of the lights, and the woman in booth 4 who smelled like a storm and saw too much. I couldn't stay behind the barrier of the service counter any longer. The distance felt artificial, a dam holding back a river that was desperate to crest. The silence in the diner had weight now, pressing against my temples, demanding action. I grabbed the spray bottle of sanitizer and a fresh rag, my props, my armor. It was a flimsy excuse. The table next to hers, booth 5, was already clean. I had wiped it down 20 minutes ago. But I needed a reason to be in her gravity, to step out of the neutral zone and into the charged field that surrounded her. I moved around the counter, the spray bottle heavy in my hand. The smell of industrial lemon cleaner usually made my stomach turn after a long shift. But tonight, it felt like a smokescreen, a chemical veil I could hide behind. I approached booth 5, my back to the rest of the empty room, effectively sealing us into a private corner of the world. I sprayed the laminate table, a fine mist settling over the surface, and began to wipe in slow, deliberate circles. I was invading her orbit under the guise of work, inching closer with every sweep of the cloth until I could hear the soft scratch of her charcoal against the paper. I dared to look. I let my gaze drift from the task at hand, over the low partition that separated the booths, and down to the open book in front of her. I expected landscapes, the moody, rain-soaked streets outside, or maybe the stark angles of the diner itself. But it wasn't architecture. It was people. The page was filled with quick, gestural sketches of faces, hands, bodies in motion. But they weren't posed. They were captured in moments of unguarded vulnerability. A man slumping over his steering wheel, a woman checking her reflection in a spoon with a look of devastation, a child crying silently. She didn't cover the page when she sensed me looking. She didn't stop drawing. The charcoal moved with a soft, rhythmic shh, shh sound that mimicked the rain. "You see everything, don't you?" I asked. The words were quiet, barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator, but they felt loud in the intimacy of the corner. She paused, the charcoal hovering millimeters above the paper. She didn't look up, but her posture shifted, leaning slightly toward me. "I see the things people think they're hiding," she said. Her voice was low, devoid of the polite cadence customers usually use with staff. "Like you. You wipe that table like you're trying to erase it." I stopped wiping. The rag went still under my hand. "It's just a job," I deflected, the automatic response rising to my lips. "Is it?" She finally looked up, turning in the booth to face me fully. Her eyes were searching, precise, surgical. They cut right through the small talk. "You move through this town like you're holding your breath, like you're waiting for permission to exhale. What are you waiting for?" The question wasn't an inquiry. It was an incision. It sliced through the layers of "I'm fine" and "just tired" that I wrap myself in every day. I felt a sudden, terrifying urge to tell her the truth, to admit that the fatigue wasn't just physical, that I felt like I was treading water in a dark lake, waiting to drown. The mask dropped completely. My shoulders slumped, the tension draining out of them, only to be replaced by a raw, exposed nerve. "I'm not waiting," I whispered, the admission tasting like ash. "I'm stuck. There's a difference." She looked at me, really looked at me, with an intensity that made my knees weak. "Only if you let the cement set," she murmured. She set the piece of charcoal down on the table. It rolled slightly, coming to rest near the edge of the booth, dangerously close to falling. Without thinking, I reached out to catch it. At the same moment, she reached to steady it. Our fingers brushed. It wasn't a collision, it was a graze. But the reaction was instantaneous. A spark of static, sharp and hot, snapped between us. It wasn't a metaphor. I felt the physical jolt of it travel up my arm, seizing the muscles in my chest. Heat flooded my skin, a sudden flush that had nothing to do with the diner's broken thermostat. For a second, neither of us moved. My hand hovered over hers, the contact point burning like a brand. The air between us thickened, heavy with the things we hadn't said, with the sudden, undeniable reality of the attraction that had been simmering for weeks. We both pulled back at the same time, a reflex of self-preservation. I clutched the rag to my chest, she folded her hands in her lap. But the damage, or the breakthrough, was done. The invisible line of professionalism, the glass wall that kept the server safe from the customer, had shattered. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, creeping toward closing time, signaling the inevitable end of the night. But the silence between us was no longer empty. It was full. The ritual of closing is a dismantling. It's the systematic deconstruction of the stage I'd been performing on for the last 8 hours. I walked to the front door, the keys heavy and cold in my palm, and flipped the sign. The plastic open disappeared, replaced by the red finality of closed. I turned the deadbolt with a solid metallic thunk that echoed through the empty room. It was the sound of the world being locked out, leaving only the two of us, sealed inside the glass box. I moved to the light panel behind the counter. One by one, I killed the banks of fluorescent tubes. The aggressive, humming glare vanished, leaving only the security lights and the neon glow from the pie case. The diner transformed instantly. Shadows stretched long across the checkerboard floor, softening the worn edges of the tables, hiding the scuffs on the linoleum. The space felt smaller, intimate, less like a place of business and more like a shelter. Adrienne hadn't moved. She hadn't buttoned her coat or reached for her bag. She sat in the semi-darkness, her sketchbook finally closed, her hands resting on top of the leather cover. She watched me. She watched as I upended the chairs on the tables around her, the metal legs scraping against the floor. She watched as I pulled the cash drawer from the register, the rhythmic clack-clack of counting coins filling the silence. Usually, customers look away during this part. They check their phones or stare out the window, embarrassed to witness the unglamorous reality of the cleanup. It's the backstage view, the dirty rags, the tired counting, the stripping away of the service magic. But she didn't look away. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, tracking my movements with that same terrifying precision. It felt like she was memorizing the way I moved when I thought the performance was over. The tension was becoming untenable. The air in the diner was thick, charged with a static that made the hair on my arm stand up. Every second she stayed past the lockup time was a violation of the unspoken contract between server and patron. The professional boundary was a wall of glass, and she was pressing her hand right against it, daring it to shatter. I had to ask her to leave. It was the procedure. It was the rule. But the words stuck in my throat, dry and impossible. I printed her check. The machine whirred, spitting out the slip of paper that reduced our entire interaction to a sum of $3.50. It felt ridiculous. Insulting, almost. I walked over to booth 4, the receipt feeling like a shield in my hand. I slid it onto the table, face down. A white flag. A prompt. "No rush," I lied, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "But I have to close out the system." She didn't reach for her wallet. She didn't even look at the paper. She looked up at me, her head tilting slightly to the side, studying my face in the dim light. The shadows cut across her features, sharpening the line of her jaw, making her eyes look impossibly dark. "You're done," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Just about," I said, wiping my hands on my apron, a nervous tick I couldn't suppress. "Just have to drop the cash in the safe." She nodded slowly. Then she leaned forward. Just an inch, but it felt like she'd crossed a mile. "What are you doing after close?" The question hung in the air, suspended between us. It wasn't the casual, "got big plans" that truckers asked to fill the silence. It was direct, intentional. It stripped away the waitress/customer dynamic in a single breath, dissolving the safety of the counter and the uniform. It was an invitation into her world, a world of expensive coats and silence and precise observation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to bruise. Panic flared, the instinct to retreat, to hide behind the policy, to make an excuse about an early shift or a cat that needed feeding. But beneath the panic, there was a thrill so sharp it felt like a cut, a pull I couldn't name, but had felt every Tuesday for a month. I looked at the empty kitchen, the dark grill, the mop bucket waiting in the corner. Then I looked back at her. "Nothing," I said, the truth tumbling out before I could catch it. "Nothing that can't wait." She smiled then, a real smile, slow and unfolding. She reached for the check, not to pay it, but to move it aside. She stood up, the leather of the booth creaking, and she seemed taller in the narrow aisle, looming in the shadows. "Good," she said, her voice low, vibrating in the sudden proximity. "I'll wait outside. Don't make me wait long." The door clicked shut behind her, but the bell didn't jingle. I had caught it with my hand, silencing the exit, needing the quiet to process what had just happened. The air in the diner felt instantly different, vacuum-sealed and volatile. I stood there for a heartbeat, staring at the empty space where she had been standing, the ghost of her scent, sandalwood and rain, still warring with the smell of stale coffee. Then the paralysis broke. I didn't walk to the back. I moved with a sudden, frantic urgency, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum as I headed for the employee break room. This wasn't just about changing clothes. It was an exorcism. I pushed through the swinging metal doors into the kitchen, the heat of the dormant grill hitting me like a physical wall. The break room was a closet, really, a cramped space that smelled of damp mops and old cardboard. I stripped off the apron first. The knot at my waist was tight, stubborn, wet from the dish pit. I yanked it free, the fabric falling heavy to the floor. It was stained with the shift, ketchup smears, coffee splashes, the invisible film of grease that coats everything in a 5-mile radius of a deep fryer. I kicked it into the corner. Next was the shirt, the polyester uniform that scratched at the neck and didn't breathe. I unbuttoned it with fingers that felt clumsy and thick, my heart hammering an erratic rhythm against my ribs. I pulled it off and stuffed it into my locker, burying the waitress identity in the dark. I wasn't her server anymore. I couldn't be. If I walked out that door wearing the uniform, the dynamic would follow me. I needed to be the woman she saw in the sketches, the one with the raw edges, not the one with the customer service smile. I stood in my undershirt in front of the small, cracked mirror over the sink. The lighting back here was cruel, a single naked bulb that cast harsh shadows under my eyes. I looked wrecked. My hair was escaping its clip in messy wisps. My skin looked pale under the grime. I turned the faucet on, the pipes groaning before spitting out freezing water. I grabbed the bar of orange industrial soap, the kind that smells like chemicals and strips the top layer of skin off, and scrubbed. I scrubbed my hands until they were red, trying to wash away the scent of onions and sanitizer. I splashed water on my face, the cold shock making me gasp, washing away the oil and the fatigue. I dried off with a rough paper towel and reached for my own clothes. My jeans, soft and worn in the knees, my boots, the leather scuffed but solid, and my jacket. It was an old motorcycle jacket I'd found at a thrift store, heavy and smelling of faint tobacco and leather. Putting it on felt like putting on armor. I zipped it up to the chin. I looked in the mirror again. The exhaustion was still there, etched in the lines around my mouth, but the deference was gone. The woman looking back wasn't waiting for an order. She was terrified, yes, but she was awake. I grabbed my bag and killed the light in the back. The darkness swallowed the room instantly. I walked back out onto the floor. The diner was a cave now, the only light coming from the street lamps outside, filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The tables were dark islands in a sea of checkered tile. It was a graveyard of the shift, silent and still. I walked past booth 4. Her cup was still there, empty. The check lay on the table, moved aside, unpaid but acknowledged. I left it. The walk to the front door felt like crossing a minefield. Every step echoed. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, drowning out the hum of the refrigerators. I was leaving the safety of the known world, the world of refills and polite distance, and stepping into something uncharted. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but the pull was stronger. It was a magnetic drag, pulling me toward the glass, toward the storm. I reached the door. My hand hovered over the push bar. This was the threshold. On this side, I knew the rules. Out there, in the rain with her, there were no menus, no scripts. I took a breath, tasting the stale air of the diner one last time, and pushed. The door swung open, heavy against the wind. The bell rang, a sharp, final note that signaled the end of the business day and the start of something else. The cold air hit me instantly, a wet, freezing slap that shocked my system awake. The sound of the rain was a roar, drowning out everything else. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the overhang offering barely any protection from the wind that whipped my hair across my face. She was there. She wasn't in the car. She was leaning against the hood of a sleek, dark sedan parked under the singular, flickering street lamp at the edge of the lot. The rain was misting around her, catching in the light like diamond dust. She had her hands in her pockets, her collar turned up against the wind. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't checking her watch. She was looking at the door. At me. The distance between the diner entrance and her car was maybe 20 feet, but it looked like a mile of wet asphalt and shadow. She pushed off the car as the door closed behind me, the latch clicking with a finality that severed the tether to the shift. She didn't wave. She just waited, a dark shape cut from the storm, watching me cross the line. The walk across the asphalt was a blur of cold rain and adrenaline. I focused on my boots hitting the wet pavement, avoiding the puddles that reflected the flickering street lamp like pools of oil. She opened the driver's side door as I reached the passenger side, the locks clicking open with a soft, mechanical thud that sounded expensive. I pulled the handle and slid inside. The door closed, sealing us in with a solid, heavy thump. Instantly, the roar of the storm was decapitated, reduced to a muffled, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The silence inside was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against my ears. It was a hermetically sealed capsule, a world entirely separate from the diner, the town, and the life I had just clocked out of. The interior smelled rich, aged leather, the faint chemical tang of a new car, and beneath it all, that overwhelming wave of sandalwood and rain that was distinctly her. It filled my lungs, dizzying and sharp, far more potent here than it had been in the open air of the diner. The heater was already humming, blowing warm air against my frozen hands, but I was shivering from something other than the cold. Adrienne settled into the driver's seat, shaking the rain from her hair. Drops of water darkened the shoulders of her wool coat. She didn't start the engine. She didn't turn on the radio or reach for the lights. She just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, staring out through the rain-slicked windshield at the dark, hulking shape of the diner. "I don't actually like coffee," she said. Her voice was quiet, absorbed by the plush interior, stripped of the ambient noise we were used to. It felt incredibly intimate, like she was speaking directly into my ear. I shifted in the seat, the leather creaking loudly under my jeans. I felt massive in the small space, clumsy and out of my depth. "I figured," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the hush. "You never finish a cup. 3 weeks and I've poured down the drain more than you've drank." She turned her head then, her profile illuminated by the dashboard lights, a soft, glowing blue that made her skin look like porcelain. "I needed a place to be," she admitted, her eyes finally finding mine. "My studio, it's too quiet. It's sterile. I stare at the canvas and I see nothing but white. But in there," she gestured vaguely toward the diner without looking away from me. "In there, everything is happening at once. It's messy. It's loud. It's real." "And that's what you were drawing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The mess?" "I was trying to find the center of it," she corrected. She shifted, turning her body toward me, the seatbelt buckle clicking against the center console. The movement brought her closer, invading the invisible boundary line running down the middle of the car. "My agent keeps telling me my work has lost its pulse, that I've forgotten what it feels like to struggle because I've been living in a glass box. So I came looking for something with a heartbeat." I felt a flush rise up my neck, hot and sudden. "So I'm just research?" The words came out sharper than I intended, a defensive reflex from the girl who just scrubbed grease off her hands in a utility closet. Just some local color to make the art feel gritty. No, she said quickly, the word cutting through the space with force. It started as observation, watching the way you move, the way you manage the chaos without breaking. But then it stopped being about the drawing. She looked down at her hands, then back at me, her gaze unflinching and dark. I stopped coming for the noise. I came because when you walked past my table, I felt like I was finally waking up. The air in the car seemed to contract, pulling tight around us. The heater hummed, a low drone that underscored the sudden, terrifying intimacy of her confession. I waited for you, I whispered, the truth feeling dangerous in the enclosed space. Every Tuesday. The rest of the week is just noise, just plates and orders and people looking through me. But when you walked in, it was like someone turned the volume down. You were the only thing that made sense in that place. The admission hung between us, heavy and undeniable. The windows were starting to fog up from the difference in temperature, isolating us even further from the outside world. Every small movement felt magnified. The rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers tapped once against the wheel, the sound of my own breathing. The conversation had stripped away the last of the pretense. We weren't talking about art or coffee anymore. We were talking about the magnetic, terrifying pull that had dragged us both into this car. The silence returned, but now it wasn't empty. It was full, vibrating with the static of two bodies too close, waiting for the spark to jump the gap. The space between the driver's seat and the passenger side is a strange no man's land. In the diner, I had the counter, the register, and the width of the aisle to protect me. Those were physical fortifications, boundaries built into the architecture of the job. But here, in the dark intimacy of the sedan, the only thing separating us was a center console of brushed aluminum and leather. It was a barrier of inches, not feet, and it felt terrifyingly permeable. Adrienne shifted again, turning her body as far as the steering wheel would allow, so she was facing me completely. The leather of her seat groaned softly, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet. The blue light from the dashboard cast the lower half of her face in shadow, but her eyes caught the reflection of the street lamp outside, glinting like wet slate. The clinical detachment was gone. The surgical precision she used to dissect the world on paper had dissolved. In its place was something softer, something searching. She wasn't looking at a subject anymore. She was looking at me. I thought I was making it up, she said, her voice dropping another octave, vibrating against the windows. The tension. I thought it was just projection. That I was so desperate for something real that I was inventing a frequency that wasn't there. You didn't invent it, I whispered. My throat felt tight, constricted by the sudden, overwhelming reality of her proximity. I felt it every time you looked at me. It felt like static, like walking across a carpet in socks and waiting for the shock. She looked down at the space between us. Her hand, the one that had been gripping the steering wheel, uncurled. She moved it slowly, deliberately, placing it on the center console. Her fingers were long and pale in the dashboard glow, resting on the leather armrest just inches from my own elbow. She didn't reach for me. She just placed her hand there, in the neutral zone, palm up, fingers slightly curled. It was an offering, a question posed in physical space. The air in the car seemed to ionize. The heat radiating from her hand was palpable, a ghost warmth that bridged the gap before skin even touched skin. I stared at her hand. It was the hand that held the charcoal, the hand that captured the exhaustion of strangers, now waiting, open and empty. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, the confession torn out of me. I know how to serve coffee. I know how to deflect drunk guys. I don't know how to be here with you. You're already here, she murmured. Her gaze moved from her hand to my face, holding me pinned. We're both just two people hiding from the rain. There is no script for this part. That's why it's terrifying. And that's why it matters. The subtext was loud, drowning out the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers. We weren't talking about the storm. We were talking about the hunger that had been sitting in booth 4 for a month. We were talking about the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people but never actually seen. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm. The fear was still there. the fear of the class gap, the fear of the morning after. But the pull was stronger. It was a gravitational force, inevitable and heavy. I looked at her hand again. The distance was negligible, a few inches of air. But crossing it meant acknowledging that the Tuesday night ritual wasn't just a habit. It was a lifeline. I moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a surrender. My hand lifted from my lap, heavy and trembling, and moved across the divide. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, feeling the heat coming off her skin, and then I let my hand settle over hers. The contact was electric. Her skin was cool from the rain, but her palm was warm. As soon as my skin touched hers, I felt her pulse jump beneath my fingers, a quick, erratic flutter that matched my own. It was a shock to the system, grounding and dizzying all at once. The static didn't discharge. It amplified. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since she walked into the diner. Her fingers shifted beneath mine, not grabbing, just adjusting, as if to confirm that I was actually there, that I was solid. The silence stretched, suspending time, the only reality the point of contact where our hands met on the console. An anchor dropped in the middle of a storm. She turned her hand over beneath mine. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like the turning of a heavy page in a book. Her fingers slipped between mine, sliding into the spaces as if they had been measured for them, long before we ever met. It wasn't a tentative clasp, the kind you test the waters with. It was a lock. She squeezed, a solid, grounding pressure that traveled up my arm and settled deep in my chest, anchoring me to the seat, to the car, to her. This wasn't the frantic, messy fumble I had half expected in the adrenaline haze of the night. It wasn't about the immediate gratification of a kiss or the shedding of clothes in a cramped back seat. It was deeper than that. It was the profound, bone-deep relief of being held. For the first time in years, the weight of the customer service mask was gone. I wasn't performing. I wasn't bracing for a complaint or a demand or a manager's shout. I was just existing. And for a woman who spent her life observing the cracks in other people's foundations, Adrienne seemed perfectly content to just hold mine together. "I can drive you home," she said, her voice barely rising above the hum of the heater. She didn't look at me. She looked at our joined hands, watching the way my rough, work-worn knuckles contrasted with her smooth, pale skin. "Or," she added, her thumb brushing the back of my hand in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, "we can just sit here until the rain stops, until the world comes back." The offer hung there, open-ended and terrifying. Going home meant returning to the cold apartment, the stack of bills on the counter, the reality of the morning shift and the uniform that was waiting to be washed. Staying meant stepping further into the unknown. It meant admitting that I didn't want the night to end, that the silence of this car was preferable to the noise of my own life. "I'm not in a rush," I whispered, leaning my head back against the headrest, watching the water distort the streetlights on the glass. "Let it rain." She nodded, a small, satisfied movement. She reached out with her free hand, the one not tangled with mine, and finally started the engine. The dashboard lit up fully, bathing us in a soft, artificial twilight of blues and ambers. The headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the falling rain like millions of falling stars. The storm outside was still raging, hammering against the metal shell of the car, but inside there was a quiet, terrifying peace. The chaos of the diner, the noise of the orders, the clatter of the plates, it all felt a million miles away. I realized then that the routine was broken. The Tuesday night ritual of coffee and silence was dead, replaced by something volatile and real. I looked at her profile, sharp and beautiful in the dashboard glow, and felt a surge of fear mixed with a wild, reckless hope. This was dangerous. Crossing the line always is. It meant complicating the one place I went to work, tangling my livelihood with a woman who lived in a different stratosphere. But as she put the car in gear, her hand never leaving mine, I knew I wouldn't trade this terrifying proximity for all the safety in the world. The world was opening up, dissolving the walls of the glass box I'd been living in. The car pulled away from the curb, the tires hissing on the wet asphalt. I watched the diner fade into the rearview mirror, a glowing box of loneliness shrinking into the distance. The heater was warm, the wipers kept a steady, hypnotic rhythm, and the weight of her hand in mine felt like a promise. The storm was still out there, but for the first time, I wasn't weathering it alone. If you've ever found an unexpected anchor in the middle of your own storm, subscribe for more stories like this. And check out the next video for another rainy night where the lines get crossed.